Hello, I'm Andrew and I'm here today to show you and to tell you a little bit of information about the violin and the viola. I started by playing a piece of music that was written just over 100 years ago by the Spanish composer Manuel de Falla, which uses the rhythms and the textures of Spanish, southern Spain's flamenco music, the traditional music of southern Spain. And you can just imagine people dancing to that and clapping their hands and playing the castanets and lots of wild whirling around going on.
What's the difference between a violin and a viola?
Basically, the viola is just a slightly larger version. If I line it up there, look, it's difficult to do. There we go. So slightly bigger with a slightly deeper voice, but there's not a huge amount of difference between them. Each instrument has 4 strings, and the bottom 3 strings of the violin, the G, D and A, are the same as the top 3 on the viola. So exactly the same. They sound slightly different sort of quality of sound. The viola's a little bit deeper. That's because it's got a bigger amplifier, and you'll see the strings are a little bit longer and a little bit thicker, so it just makes a slightly different sound. Now on the violin, our 4th string is the E string, this one, which enables us to play much higher notes, so we can go kind of up to about there. Whereas on the viola, let me swap over, the viola has this fantastic low C string, which gives it this sort of really dark, rich sound. So you can hear the difference. The violin's much more bright in sound and the viola deeper and richer. And composers really like the sound of the viola when they want to make the music sound a little bit, not exactly sad, but a little bit melancholy. That's a good word. And that sort of a really kind of rich, dark sound. The viola fits in between the violins and the cellos in an orchestra. So the violin family goes violin, viola, cello, gradually getting lower in pitch, and then double bass at the very bottom, which gives us the really low notes. And the violin is the violin family is the core of an orchestra. So about 2/3 of the people in an orchestra. So around about, if the orchestra's about 80, there are about 50 of the musicians will be string players.
Where does the violin come from?
The violin was developed really in the early 16th century in Italy. It came as a sort of update of earlier instruments, the lira, the rebec and the viol, which had been around for quite some time, especially the rebec goes right back to the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages. But around about 500 years ago, this design came upon, and it really has changed very little in the last 500 years. It works extremely well. It's a very flexible instrument. You can get lots of different sounds out of it. You can play lovely slow sustained melodies. You can play lots of flashy special effects, like my very first piece that I played.
How come the violin hasn't changed much all these years?
I think part of the reason why it hasn't changed is because it fits in so well with so many different types of music. The classical, jazz, folk from all around the world. There's lots of folk traditions, particularly in Europe, the Scottish, Irish folk music, the British, English folk music, and even things like Norway has the hardang of fiddle, and there's a fiddle tradition in most European countries.
Are there any other types of music where we can hear the violin?
film music, I mean, you'll hear the bowed stringed instruments play a huge part in film tunes, especially when you hear a big sweeping heroic melody played by 50 string instruments all together, like this one, for example, which you might recognise. Bit of E.T. there.
Does the violin sound best on its own or with other instruments?
One violin can play on its own, and that sounds fantastic and really interesting. But the violin works best in combinations with other instruments. And one of the most exciting things about it is this variety of different music that you can play. To give you an example of two violins playing together, I have a little recording here of my friend Letitia and I, who we're going to play a little tune that you might recognise. Thank you, Letitia. That was great. Really, really good. So there are many groups as well made up of just the bowed stringed instruments. Most famously, I think, the string quartet, which composes from Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, from the classical era right up to modern day, have used that texture of 4 stringed instruments. So it's 2 violins, 1 viola and 1 cello. It's the classic string quartet. And you'll find that in a lot of music. It was used a lot by the Beatles, actually, in the 1960s for their pop tunes. So you find that, you'll find bigger groups of string instruments together, the sextets, octets, that's 8 people.
So, why do composers write so much for strings?
So one of the reasons why composers really enjoy writing for strings is the different colours and textures. So in that first piece I played, you heard some kind of notes played that I didn't play with the bow. I played pizzicato, plucking with one finger. And sometimes you'll even see violinists playing pizzicato with the other hand. Sometimes that happens as well. And all these different sounds that happen. So if the music gets a little bit kind of spooky, you sometimes hear a tremolo effect. Oh, it sounds quite scary and spooky. Or you can often get the use of harmonics. Now, harmonics are really interesting because they have a certain quality of sound. They're very sort of slightly flat sounding in terms of the quality of the sound. And composers will use those. So most of the time we play with the bow normally, with a little bit of vibrato. That's the kind of shaking of my hands, which just adds to the richness of the sound a little bit. And then even more special effects, sometimes you'll hear a very sort of glassy, icy sound, which is called sul ponticello. So this thing here on the violin, I don't know if you can see this sort of bit of wood here that holds the strings up off the fingerboard. That's called the bridge. And if you play... You'll get that in orchestral music, sometimes film music particularly, again when they want things to sound a bit weird and strange. In the blues tradition in America, one of the things they kind of always come back to is the train, is imitating the sound and the noise of a train whistle and things like that. So this is one of those. This is a piece of American blues music called Number 12 Train.
Why did you start playing the violin?
So I was already playing the piano. I was about 7 years old, and my parents took me to an orchestral concert, and they said, well, which instruments do you like? What would you like to learn how to play? And I loved all the really bright sounds and was particularly drawn to the trumpet and to the violin. And it just so happened that at that time I was 7 and I'd lost my 2 front teeth. So when we went to see a man who, a very important man called Dr. Swinburne, who was in charge of music there in Colchester at the time. And he said, well, it's kind of difficult to learn how to play the trumpet without any front teeth. So let's put you on the violin. And that's how I started. And I very quickly really loved it and got on very well.
How old is your violin and where was it made?
So this is my violin. It was made in Plumstead in southeast London in 1934. So just before the Second World War. And it makes it 86 years old.
How long did it take you to learn the violin?
The violin. Well, I've been playing the violin for over 50 years, just over 50 years now. And I really feel that I'm still learning and I'm getting better all the time. But I guess to answer your question in a more sensible way, I think it took about 10 years of really hard work to start to get really good. So it's a tough thing to learn, but really fun when you get it.